The cobblestones of Stare Miesto were still wet from the night's rain when the first bread sellers pushed their carts across the Charles Bridge, their wooden wheels catching in the gaps between stones worn smooth by 6 centuries of footsteps. It was not yet 5 in the morning, and Prague in 1900 was already awake, not with the frantic energy of Paris or the industrial thunder of Manchester, but with a particular, unhurried intensity that belonged only to this city, wedged between empires, fluent in 3 languages, loyal to none entirely. Prague at the turn of the 20th century occupied a peculiar position in the architecture of European civilization. It was the 3rd largest city in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, after Vienna and Budapest, and yet it felt like a world unto itself. A labyrinth of Gothic towers, Baroque facades, and newly erected Art Nouveau buildings whose golden ornamentation caught the morning light like something hallucinated. The population hovered around 400,000 souls, divided by language, class, and a political tension so embedded in daily life that even the choice of which cafe to enter in the morning carried ideological weight. Czech workers drank at Czech establishments, German-speaking merchants gathered at their own, and the Jewish intellectuals, who would, within a single generation, give the world Franz Kafka, Max Brod, and a literature of existential unease, unlike anything produced before or since, navigated between both worlds with the practiced invisibility of those accustomed to belonging everywhere and nowhere at once. To walk the streets of Prague in 1900 was to experience a city in the violent, exhilarating process of becoming. The old medieval ghetto of Josefov had just been demolished, a decision that still divided opinion among historians and preservationists, replaced by wide Parisian-style boulevards lined with opulent apartment buildings whose facades dripped with the sinuous curves of the secession movement. The smell of fresh plaster competed with the older, deeper odor of the river, the Vltava, which carried with it the particular mineral coldness of mountain water that had traveled through Bohemia for centuries before reaching the city's heart. On humid mornings, the scent of that river rose through the streets of Malostrană in a low mist, curling around the gas lamps that had only recently replaced the older oil fixtures. Lamps that emitted not the clean white light we associate with electricity, but a warm, slightly greenish amber glow accompanied by a faint, persistent hiss, like the city itself exhaling. The sounds of Prague in 1900 deserve particular attention because they have been lost entirely. The electric tram had just been introduced on several main lines, replacing the horse-drawn cars that had operated since 1875, and the noise it produced was entirely new to human ears. A high metallic scraping as the wheels navigated the rails, punctuated by the sharp ring of the conductor's bell, a sound that residents initially found alarming and later came to associate with modernity itself. Beneath that sound ran an older acoustic layer, the clop of horse hooves on stone, the calls of water sellers, the rhythmic hammer of a cobbler working in an open doorway on Milantrakova Street, the distant choir practice emanating each morning from the churches of the old town, where the liturgy was performed in Czech, in Latin, and, in certain parishes, in German, all within walking distance of each other. This linguistic complexity was not merely cultural color, it was the central psychological fact of existence in Prague at 1900. The city had been officially bilingual under Habsburg administrative law since 1880, requiring civil servants to be proficient in both Czech and German, a regulation that satisfied no one and inflamed everyone. Czech nationalists, riding the crest of a cultural renaissance that had been building since the mid-19th century, saw German language dominance as a form of ongoing occupation. German-speaking Bohemians, many of whose families had lived in the region for generations, experienced the rising political power of the Czech majority as existential threat, and between them, negotiating this minefield daily, moved the Jewish community of Prague, the oldest Jewish settlement in Central Europe, whose cemetery in Osefov contained graves stacked 12 layers deep, because the medieval city had refused to grant them additional land for their dead. It is worth pausing on that cemetery, because it contains within it a mystery that opens into the deepest questions about this city's identity. Among the stones of the old Jewish cemetery, one grave belongs to Rabbi Judah Lo ben Bezalel, the Maharal of Prague, who died in 1609, and around his tomb had accumulated, by 1900, a mythology so powerful that it had crossed from religious tradition into the cultural bloodstream of the entire city. The Maharal was said to have created the golem, a being of animated clay, summoned to protect the Jewish community from persecution, brought to life by the Hebrew word for truth inscribed upon its forehead, and destroyed by the erasure of a single letter. By 1900, this legend had been retold in German, in Czech, and in Yiddish, had inspired theatrical productions and penny pamphlets, and was in the process of becoming one of the founding myths of modern science fiction. A young insurance clerk named Franz Kafka had not yet written a word of the work that would make him immortal, but he was already walking these streets, already absorbing this atmosphere of ancient weight and modern anxiety, and one could argue without excessive romanticism that the golem was the direct ancestor of his most famous invention. A man transformed overnight into something no longer recognized as human. The workers of Prague in 1900 inhabited a different city than the intellectuals and merchants, though their lives intersected at precise, revealing points. The industrial suburbs of Žižkov and Smíchov had grown explosively in the preceding decades, absorbing a migration of rural Czechs from Bohemia and Moravia, who came seeking wages in the textile mills, the ironworks, and the printing houses that were rapidly mechanizing. A factory worker in Žižkov in 1900 earned approximately 8 to 12 kronen per week, enough to rent a single room in a building that likely housed 4 families per floor, to eat black bread and potatoes daily with meat appearing on Sundays, and to send a portion home to a village that increasingly depended on urban remittances to survive. His working day began at 6 and ended at 7, 6 days per week, in spaces lit by gas and later by electric arc lamps that produced a harsh, flickering light, hard on the eyes and accompanied by a faint smell of burning, that workers eventually stopped noticing entirely. What he wore to that factory tells us something precise: a rough linen shirt, trousers of heavy cotton twill, dyed in dark colors specifically chosen to disguise staining, boots resoled so many times that the original leather had been entirely replaced, and, on Sundays, on festival days, on the day a man might visit the center of the city he worked to maintain but rarely occupied, a jacket of boiled wool in dark blue or brown, purchased second-hand from one of the dealers in Havelska Street, smelling faintly of its previous owner and of the camphor used to preserve it between wearings. Above this world, separated by the width of the Vltava and by an economic distance far greater, lived the bourgeoisie of Prague's new town, the Nové Město, in apartments whose ceilings rose to 4 meters, whose windows opened onto street-level cafe terraces, and whose interiors reflected the full ambition of Central European taste at the turn of the century. The furniture was heavy, dark, and elaborate. The walls were covered in patterned fabric or elaborate plasterwork. The piano in the parlor was not decorative. It was played daily, by daughters whose marriageability was partly evaluated by their musical accomplishment, and by fathers who had grown up in the era of Dvořák and Smetana and considered music a form of national declaration as much as personal pleasure. Smetana's Ma Vlast, My Homeland, had premiered in 1882, and by 1900 its opening tone poem, Vyšehrad, had become something close to a secular hymn. A piece of music that could make a middle-class Czech businessman weep openly in a concert hall without any loss of dignity, because the emotion being expressed was not personal grief, but collective longing. And in Prague in 1900, collective longing was the shared currency of an entire civilization. This was the city that stood at the threshold of the 20th century, ancient and electric, divided and dreaming, smelling of river water and fresh plaster and coal smoke and yeast from the breweries of Smíchov. It did not yet know what was coming. It did not know that the empire that administered it had less than 2 decades left. It did not know that the young men drinking coffee in its cafes and debating Czech sovereignty and the nature of consciousness would, within a generation, face a war that would shatter the political architecture of everything they had ever known. Prague in 1900 existed in the last great suspension of European civilization before the fall, luminous, complicated, irreplaceable, and, for those fortunate or unfortunate enough to have lived within it, absolutely impossible to forget.